The twin daughters of a pastor vanished in 1993. 30 years later, one walked into a church holding their childhood hymnal, and what she whispered before collapsing would shatter everything the congregation thought they knew about faith, family, and the darkness that can hide behind holy walls. The woman appeared during the closing hymn of Sunday service at New Hope Baptist Church, slipping through the heavy oak doors like a ghost, materializing from decades of prayer. Pastor Williams noticed her first, something about the way she moved, hesitant yet determined, clutching an old blue hymnal against her chest like it contained the secrets of salvation itself. She was thin, weathered in a way that spoke of years, lived too hard, too fast. Her auburn hair hung in uneven strands around a face that might have once been beautiful, before whatever had carved those lines around her eyes and left her hands trembling against the worn leather binding. The congregation kept singing Amazing Grace, their voices rising toward the vaulted ceiling. But Pastor Williams felt his words catch in his throat. There was something familiar about her, something that made his chest tighten with a recognition he couldn't quite place. She stood in the back pew, not singing, just listening with her eyes closed and tears streaming down her cheeks. The hymnal shook in her grasp. When the final note faded and the congregation began to settle, she started walking down the center aisle. Her bare feet made no sound against the red carpet, but every step felt like thunder in the sudden quiet. People turned to stare. This was a small church where everyone knew everyone, where strangers were noticed and welcomed. She stopped. 3 rows from the front, directly in front of the stained glass window depicting Christ with children gathered at his feet. The colored light painted her face in blues and golds, and for a moment she looked almost ethereal, like she belonged in the glass itself. "We used to sing together," she whispered, her voice carrying in the silence with startling clarity. The hymnal slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo forever. Then her knees buckled, and she collapsed right there in the aisle, unconscious before anyone could catch her. Pastor Williams rushed forward, his heart hammering against his ribs, because now he recognized what had been nagging at him. The hymnal lying open beside her was inscribed in careful child's handwriting. Property of Sarah and Rebecca Fletcher, 1993. 30 years earlier, on a July morning that shimmered with Georgia heat, 12-year-old Sarah Fletcher stood at the piano bench beside her twin sister Rebecca, their voices blending in perfect harmony as they led the congregation through "This Little Light of Mine." Sarah's fingers danced across the keys, while Rebecca's clear soprano soared above the melody, and their father, Pastor Tom Fletcher, watched from the pulpit with the kind of pride that made his chest ache. The twins were mirror images in reverse. Sarah, dark-haired and serious. Rebecca, blonde and bright as summer lightning. They wore matching blue dresses their mother Ruth had sewn, with white collars that made them look like angels. Which is exactly what the congregation called them, these preachers' daughters, who could make grown men weep with their Sunday morning. "Duets, beautiful as always, girls," whispered Mrs. Henderson as they filed past her pew after the service ended. Rebecca beamed and curtsied, making the old woman laugh, while Sarah just smiled shyly and clutched her hymnal tighter. They were different as night and day, but you never saw one without the other. Pastor Fletcher finished shaking hands with departing congregants and found his daughters sitting on the front steps of the church, sharing a bag of peppermints their mother had packed in their Sunday school bag. The Georgia sun painted everything gold, and Rebecca was telling Sarah about the butterfly she'd seen during prayer time, her hands fluttering to demonstrate its flight. "Daddy, can we go to the revival meeting tonight?" Rebecca asked, bouncing, on her toes. "Brother Marcus said there's going to be special music and maybe healing, and—" "We'll see, sweetheart," Tom said, running his hand through her hair. Sarah looked up from her hymnal, where she'd been tracing the words to their morning song with her finger. "Will there be other children there?" she asked quietly. Sarah was always the cautious one, needing to know what to expect. "I'm sure there will be," Tom assured her. "Brother Marcus has quite a following. People come from all over to hear him preach." Rebecca grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her to her feet. "Come on, let's practice our harmony for tonight. We could sing Amazing Grace if he calls for volunteers." They skipped toward the parsonage next door, their voices already twining together. In song, blonde head and dark head bent close as sisters. Tom watched them go, unaware that by tomorrow morning, those voices would be silenced forever. The revival tent rose from the red Georgia clay like a white canvas cathedral, its peaked, roof straining against guy wires in the humid evening air. Inside, folding chairs stretched in crooked rows toward a makeshift stage, where Brother Marcus commanded attention with arms spread wide, his voice booming over the crowd of 300 souls seeking salvation. Pastor Fletcher sat in the third row with his daughters, watching the traveling evangelist work the crowd into a fervor he'd never quite managed in his own pulpit. Brother Marcus was younger than Tom by a decade, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of magnetic presence that made people lean forward when he spoke, desperate to catch every word. "Who among you has children?" Brother Marcus called out, his eyes scanning the tent. "Bring them forward. Let the little ones come unto me, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Rebecca's hand shot up before Tom could stop her. She bounced in her chair, whispering urgently to Sarah, "We should sing, remember what we practiced." Sarah shook her head, suddenly shy in the face of all those staring eyes. But Brother Marcus had already spotted them, his gaze lingering on. The twins with an intensity that made Tom shift uncomfortably in his metal chair. "Pastor Fletcher," Brother Marcus's voice carried across the tent. "I see you've brought your beautiful daughters. Would they honor us with a song?" The crowd turned, expectantly, and Rebecca was already standing, pulling Sarah up beside her. They walked to the front with their blue hymnal, Rebecca confident and glowing, Sarah hesitant but loyal to her sister's enthusiasm. Their voices rose together in amazing grace, pure and clear above the rustling of paper fans and quiet weeping. When they finished, the tent erupted in amends and praise, but Brother Marcus's attention remained fixed on the girls with an expression Tom couldn't quite read. "Blessed are the pure in heart," Brother Marcus said, stepping down from the platform. He knelt before the twins, his hands reaching toward them. Such precious gifts from God. Sarah stepped back instinctively, but Rebecca stood still as Brother Marcus placed his hands on their heads in what looked like benediction. His fingers lingered too long in Rebecca's blonde hair, and when he looked up at Tom, his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Your daughters have a special light, Pastor Fletcher, the kind that draws people from far and wide. I'd love to discuss their spiritual development with you after service." Tom nodded politely, but something cold had settled in his stomach as he watched Brother Marcus's hands finally fall away from his children's heads. The parking lot buzzed with conversation as families filtered away from the revival tent, car doors slamming and engines turning over in the thick July night. Pastor Fletcher stood near his sedan, discussing the evening service with Deacon Harris, while Sarah and Rebecca waited nearby, still clutching their hymnal and basking in the compliments from departing congregants. "Those girls of yours are something special," Mrs. Caldwell said, patting Rebecca's cheek. "Voices like angels." Brother Marcus emerged from the tent surrounded by his team of volunteers, men in cheap suits who'd been collecting offerings and managing the crowd. He spotted the Fletcher family immediately and made his way over, his smile warm and ministerial in the yellow glow of the parking lot lights. "Pastor Fletcher, might I have a word?" Brother Marcus approached with two of his associates flanking him. "I've been thinking about what we discussed regarding the girls' spiritual gifts," Tom nodded, though he couldn't recall agreeing to any discussion. "Of course, Brother Marcus. I run a summer ministry program for gifted young people," Brother Marcus continued, his voice carrying the same hypnotic cadence he'd used in the tent. "Children with special callings, like your daughters. We travel, sharing the gospel, nurturing their talents. It's quite an honor to be selected." Rebecca's eyes lit up. "We could travel and sing for people." "Indeed, child. God has blessed you both with remarkable gifts." Brother Marcus knelt to their level, his hands once again finding their way to the girls' shoulders. "I'd like to invite you to join us for a few days. See how you take to the ministry life." Sarah frowned, looking between her father and the evangelist. "Daddy?" Tom felt that same cold unease from earlier, but Brother Marcus's volunteers were nodding approvingly, and Deacon Harris was saying what an opportunity it would be. The social pressure felt overwhelming in the humid air. "I'm not sure that's—" Tom began. "Just for tonight," Brother Marcus interrupted smoothly. "Let them ride with us to our next meeting in Valdosta. You could follow behind, see how they do. If it doesn't feel right, we'll bring them straight back." Rebecca was already tugging on Tom's sleeve. "Please, Daddy, we want to sing for more people." Against every instinct screaming in his head, Tom found himself nodding. Brother Marcus's volunteers were already walking toward a large van, and Rebecca was bouncing with excitement while Sarah hesitated. "Come along, girls," Brother Marcus said, taking each twin by the hand. "God's work waits for no one." They walked toward the van, Rebecca chattering excitedly, while Sarah looked back at her father with uncertain eyes. Tom started to follow, but Brother Marcus held up a hand. "We'll take good care of them, Pastor. See you in Valdosta." The van doors closed with a soft click that sounded like thunder in Tom's ears. Pastor Tom Fletcher stood behind the pulpit of New Hope Baptist Church, staring out at the congregation that had gathered for Sunday service, but the words of his sermon died in his throat. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah and Rebecca vanished into that van with Brother Marcus, and every face looking back at him seemed to ask the same unspoken question: how does a man of God lose his own children? Ruth sat in the front pew where she always did, but her usual supportive smile had been replaced by hollow eyes and hands that trembled when she thought no one was looking. She'd stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped believing that prayer could bring their babies home. The church ladies brought casseroles and whispered comfort, but their offerings felt like funeral food. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Tom began, his voice cracking on the familiar phrase. Mrs. Henderson nodded encouragingly from her usual spot, but he could see the doubt creeping into even her faithful eyes. How could he preach about God's protection when he'd handed his daughters over to a predator in plain sight? Detective Morrison had called that morning with the same update he'd given for weeks. No leads, no sightings, no trace of Brother Marcus or his traveling ministry. The van had vanished like smoke, leaving behind only flyers for a revival that had never existed, and a post office box in Atlanta that led nowhere. "We believe they're still alive," Morrison had said in his flat, professional tone. "These cases, sometimes they surface years later. Don't give up hope." But hope felt like a luxury Tom couldn't afford. He'd driven to every town in a 100-mile radius, showing the girls' school photos to gas station clerks and diner waitresses. He'd called every church in the southeast, asking about traveling evangelists. He'd even hired a private investigator, who took his money and produced nothing but empty promises. The congregation was growing restless, shifting in their seats as their pastor struggled to find his way through another stumbling sermon about faith and trust. Tom looked down at his notes at the careful theology he'd prepared and pushed the papers aside. "I don't know why God allows children to disappear," he said quietly. "I don't know why evil wears the mask of righteousness. I don't know why a father's worst nightmare can happen in a church parking lot." The silence in the sanctuary was deafening. Ruth's soft sob echoed against the stained glass windows, where colored light had once painted his daughters' faces in blues and golds. "But I know we keep looking. We keep praying. We keep believing they're coming home." Even as he said it, Tom Fletcher felt his faith crumbling like dust between his fingers. The compound clung to the Tennessee mountainside, like a collection of forgotten prayers, weathered wooden buildings connected by dirt paths that turned to mud when it rained. Sarah and Rebecca Fletcher sat on thin mattresses in what Brother Marcus called the Children's Sanctuary, a windowless room in the basement of the main lodge where the chosen ones were brought to receive special spiritual instruction. They'd been there for 2 months, though time moved differently in the mountains where the sun never seemed to penetrate the thick canopy of pine trees. The van ride that was supposed to last one night had stretched into days, then weeks, as Brother Marcus explained that God was calling them to a higher purpose, away from the distractions of the world below. "When are we going home?" Sarah whispered to her sister in the darkness after evening prayers. They weren't allowed to speak during designated quiet hours, but the twins had developed a language of touches and silent looks that the compound members couldn't decode. Rebecca squeezed her hand 3 times, their secret signal for "I love you," and pointed toward the ceiling where they could hear footsteps moving back and forth. Brother Marcus walked the halls at night, checking on his flock, ensuring that God's chosen children were properly prepared for their divine mission. The other children ranged in age from 8 to 16, collected from various revivals and prayer meetings across the South. They all had the same hollow look in their eyes, the same careful way of speaking that meant they'd learned what happened when you asked too many questions. During the day, they studied scripture and practiced hymns. At night, they slept in rows on identical mattresses and dreamed of families they were told had abandoned them to God's greater plan. "Your father signed the papers," Brother Marcus had explained when Sarah begged to call home. "You belong to the ministry now. This is your family." But Sarah remembered her real father's face in the parking lot, the hesitation in his eyes. She remembered Mrs. Henderson's peppermints and her mother's blue dresses and the way the stained glass windows painted rainbows on the sanctuary floor. Those memories felt real in a way that nothing in the compound did. Rebecca had grown quieter. Over the weeks, her bright laughter replaced by watchful silence. She still sang during evening worship, but her voice had lost its soaring quality, becoming flat and mechanical like the other children's voices. "I want to go home," Sarah breathed against her sister's ear. Rebecca's response was barely audible. "We will. Someday we will." Above them, Brother Marcus's footsteps stopped directly overhead, and both girls held their breath until they heard him move on. Time moved like sludge through the Fletcher household, each year heavier than the last. By 1995, Ruth had stopped setting places for Sarah and Rebecca at the dinner table, though she still bought their favorite cereal and let it go stale in the pantry. By 1998, she'd stopped getting out of bed most days, leaving Tom to deliver sermons to a congregation that had learned not to mention the missing girls in his presence. The church slowly emptied. Families moved away or found new congregations where tragedy hadn't stained the altar, and the pastor's eyes didn't go hollow when children sang in the choir. By 2001, Sunday services drew maybe 30 souls, mostly elderly parishioners who remembered when New Hope Baptist had been the beating heart of their community. Ruth died on a Tuesday in March of 2003, 10 years to the day after the twins vanished. The doctors called it heart failure, but Tom knew better. She'd simply run out of reasons to keep breathing. He buried her in the plot they'd bought for their retirement years, leaving 2 empty spaces beside her headstone for daughters who might never come home. Detective Morrison retired in 2005, but he still called Tom every year on the anniversary, his voice growing more weathered with each conversation. "Still keeping the case open," he'd say, though they both knew the file had been moved to storage years ago. Something might still turn up, but nothing ever did. The private investigators had long since moved on to paying clients. The flyers with the girls' school photos had faded from telephone poles and store windows. Even the memorial garden the church ladies had planted behind the sanctuary was overgrown now, choked with weeds that no one had the heart to pull. Tom, aged 20 years in the span of 10, his dark hair gone silver, his shoulders curved under the weight of unanswered prayers. He still preached every Sunday to his dwindling flock, but his sermons had become meditations on loss, theological wrestlings with a God who allowed children to disappear without explanation. On quiet evenings, he'd sit in the sanctuary and play Amazing Grace on the old piano, his fingers finding the melody Sarah had once played, while Rebecca's voice soared above the congregation. Sometimes he thought he could hear them singing along, their harmony floating down from the rafters like ghosts made of music. The twins' bedroom remained untouched, a shrine to childhood interrupted. Their blue dresses still hung in the closet. Their shared hymnal still sat on the nightstand, open to the last song they'd practiced together. Somewhere in the Tennessee mountains, his daughters were growing up without him, if they were growing up at all. 17 years had passed when Sarah Fletcher, now 29 and known only as Sister Grace within the compound walls, finally understood that prayers without action were just whispered surrender. She knelt beside Rebecca's mattress in the pre-dawn darkness, watching her twin sister's face in the pale moonlight, filtering through the single barred window they'd been allowed after years of perfect obedience. Rebecca looked older than her. Years, her blonde hair now kept short and severe, her bright spirit dimmed to a flicker that only Sarah could still recognize. The compound had broken something essential in her sister. The bold, singing girl who'd once dragged Sarah toward every adventure was now the one who whispered warnings about drawing attention, about hoping for things beyond these mountain walls. Tonight, Sarah breathed against Rebecca's ear, so quietly the sound barely disturbed the air between them. The new girl said the back gate's lock is broken. We can get through the fence. Rebecca's eyes opened, instantly alert despite the late hour. After 17 years, they still communicated in the language of twins, reading each other's thoughts in glances and touches. But where Sarah saw possibility, Rebecca saw only danger. "They'll find us," Rebecca whispered back. "You know what happened to Michael when he tried to run." Sarah remembered. Brother Marcus had made the entire compound watch as the 15-year-old boy was dragged back, bloody and broken, after 3 days in the woods. Michael had never spoken again after that, just stared at nothing with dead eyes until he'd simply stopped breathing one winter morning. "We're smarter than Michael," Sarah insisted. "We know these mountains now. We can make it to the highway. Find help." Rebecca gripped her sister's hand with desperate strength. "And if we don't? If they catch us? You know Marcus won't let us stay together after this. He's been talking about sending you to the sister compound in Kentucky." The sister compound, a place of rumors and whispered horrors that made their current captivity seem merciful by comparison. Sarah had seen the hollow expressions of women who'd returned from Kentucky, seen how they moved like broken birds with clipped wings. "Then we run now." "Before he can separate us," Sarah pressed. "Rebecca, we're 29 years old. We've lost half our lives to this place. How much more are we willing to give him?" Rebecca stared at the ceiling where Brother Marcus's footsteps had worn grooves in the floor above them during 17 years of nightly patrols. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of a decision that would haunt one of them forever. "You go," she whispered. "I'll cover for you. Tell them you're sick. Buy you time." "Not without you." "Yes, without me. One of us has to make it home." Sarah had walked for 3 days through the Tennessee mountains before she reached the first highway, her bare feet bleeding through the thin soles of compound-issued shoes. When Pastor Williams of Shiloh Baptist found her sitting on the church steps that Sunday morning, she told him her name was Ruth, after her mother, after the woman who'd died waiting for daughters who never came home. "I'm looking for my family," she said, which was both truth and lie wrapped together like the threadbare shawl she'd worn through 17 winters in the mountains. Pastor Williams was a kind man with gentle eyes, who asked no questions she wasn't ready to answer, just gave her food and a place to sleep in exchange for helping with the church cleaning. She stayed 3 months in that first congregation, learning how to be human again. How to look people in the eye without flinching, how to speak without asking permission first, how to believe that kindness could exist without conditions attached. The church ladies brought her clothes that actually fit, taught her to braid, her hair in ways that didn't mark her as different, helped her apply for the identification papers that would let her move freely through the world. But at night, she dreamed of Rebecca. Dreams where her sister called out for help while Sarah kept walking. Dreams where Brother Marcus's voice echoed through empty hallways, asking where Sister Grace had gone. She'd wake with tears on her cheeks and guilt heavy as stones in her chest, knowing that her freedom had been bought with her twins' sacrifice. From Tennessee, she walked to Alabama, then Mississippi, working her way through small towns and rural churches, always moving south toward Georgia, toward home. She cleaned sanctuaries and organized food pantries, her hands remembering the muscle memory of service, even as her heart slowly remembered how to hope. In each new congregation, she practiced being Sarah Fletcher again. She'd hum the old hymns, under her breath while she worked, testing whether the melodies still fit her voice. She'd tell people fragments of her story, how she'd grown up in a preacher's family, how she'd been lost for a long time but was finding her way back to God. The pastors and church members saw a woman seeking redemption, someone running from a past she couldn't quite name. They welcomed her with the automatic hospitality of the faithful, never suspecting they were harboring a ghost made flesh. After 2 years of wandering, Sarah stood at the Georgia state line with her mother's hymnal, clutched against her chest, the one thing she'd managed to take from the compound during her escape. Inside the front cover, her own childhood handwriting stared back at her. Property of Sarah and Rebecca Fletcher, 1993. She was finally ready to go home. Pastor Tom Fletcher sat beside the hospital bed, his 70-year-old hands trembling as he stared at the woman who'd collapsed in his church 3 days earlier. The doctors had run blood tests, taken fingerprints, made phone calls to numbers he'd memorized decades ago. Now Detective Morrison, grayer and more weathered but still carrying the same determined expression, stood in the doorway with a manila folder that could change everything. "The DNA results came back," Morrison said quietly. "Tom, it's her. It's Sarah." The words hit like lightning through his chest. Tom had imagined this moment 10,000 times over 30 years, but he'd never pictured his little girl as this hollow-eyed woman with scars on her wrists and terror in her voice whenever anyone moved too quickly. Sarah, his Sarah, who used to play piano with such joy who'd skip toward that van with her sister like she was walking into an adventure. "Sarah," he whispered, and her eyes focused on him with startling clarity. "Daddy." The word came out broken, like she wasn't sure she had permission to say it. "I tried to come home, I tried so many times, but—" Tom reached for her hand, and she flinched before allowing the contact. Her fingers were thin, work-roughened, nothing like the soft hands that used to help him turn pages in the hymnal during Sunday service. "Where have you been, sweetheart? Where's Rebecca?" The question that had lived in his throat for 30 years finally escaped, and Sarah's face crumpled. She looked exactly like Ruth in that moment, the same expression his wife had worn on the nights when hope became too heavy to carry. "She didn't make it out," Sarah whispered. The same words she'd spoken when she collapsed in the church aisle. "Rebecca. She stayed behind so I could run. She said one of us had to make it home." Morrison stepped closer, his notebook already open. "Sarah, I need you to tell me about Brother Marcus. Where did he take you? What happened to Rebecca?" Sarah closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they held 17 years of secrets. There was a compound in the Tennessee mountains. He called it God's chosen family. There were so many children, Detective Morrison. So many families still, wondering where their babies went. Tom felt his world tilt on its axis. One daughter home, one daughter lost forever, and decades of unanswered prayers that had been answered in the cruelest possible way. "I have to go back," Sarah said suddenly, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "I have to go back for Rebecca. She's still there, and she's waiting for me to keep my promise." Morrison and Tom exchanged glances. They both knew that after 30 years, some promises couldn't be kept. The FBI raid on the Tennessee compound happened at dawn on a Tuesday in October, exactly 6 months after Sarah had walked into New Hope Baptist Church carrying her childhood hymnal. She sat in the back of an unmarked van 3 miles away, watching through binoculars as federal agents swarmed the buildings she'd called home for 17 years, knowing that somewhere in that maze of weathered wood and broken dreams, her sister might still be waiting. But when the dust settled and the compound members were led away in handcuffs, Rebecca wasn't among them. The agents found 43 children and adults living in conditions that made the evening news. But Rebecca Fletcher's name appeared only on a handwritten roster in Brother Marcus's office, marked with a date from 15 years earlier and a single word: departed. Sarah testified behind closed doors at the federal courthouse in Nashville, her voice steady as she detailed decades of psychological manipulation, forced labor, and systematic abuse. She spoke of children who'd arrived as runaways and been transformed into devoted followers, of families who'd never stopped searching for sons and daughters who'd been taught to forget their own names. Brother Marcus, whose real name was Harold Eugene Parks, sat silent throughout the proceedings, his silver hair now white and his magnetic presence reduced to the hollow stare of a man whose kingdom had finally crumbled. When the judge read the verdict, guilty on 47 counts of kidnapping, human trafficking, and child endangerment, he showed no emotion, just the same blank expression he'd worn when Sarah had asked about going home all those years ago. 60 years without possibility of parole, the judge announced, and Sarah felt a satisfaction that tasted like ashes in her mouth. Justice for the living, but nothing for the sister who'd sacrificed her freedom, so Sarah could walk these mountains roads back to Georgia. After the trial, FBI agent Martinez showed Sarah a box of personal effects recovered from Brother Marcus's private quarters, Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a faded photograph of two 12-year-old girls in matching blue dresses, standing beside a church piano with their arms around each other's shoulders. "We found this in his desk," Martinez said quietly. There were others too. Pictures of all the children who came through the compound over the years. Sarah stared at the photo, Rebecca grinning widely while Sarah looked shyly at the camera, and felt the weight of 30 years crash down on her shoulders. They'd gotten justice, but they hadn't gotten Rebecca. And somewhere in the Tennessee, mountains' unmarked graves held secrets that would never testify in any courtroom. The reckoning was complete, but the healing had only just begun. On a Sunday morning in December, 1 year after Sarah Fletcher had collapsed in the aisle of New Hope Baptist Church, the sanctuary filled with voices raised in harmony for the first time in decades. The memorial service for Rebecca Fletcher drew congregants from across Georgia. Families who'd never stopped searching for their own missing children, survivors from the Tennessee compound who'd found their way home, and neighbors who remembered. Two little girls in matching blue dresses singing like angels. Sarah stood at the piano where she'd played so many years ago, her fingers finding the familiar keys of Amazing Grace, while her father's congregation sang the words that had carried her through 17 years of captivity. Her voice, weathered but still clear, rose above the others in the soprano part that had once belonged to her sister. Pastor Tom Fletcher, now retired but standing tall behind his old pulpit, watched his surviving daughter with eyes that held both profound grief and impossible gratitude. The church was fuller than it had been since 1993, filled with people drawn together by the mystery of faith that could survive even the worst betrayals. Detective Morrison sat in the third pew, his silver hair catching the light from the stained glass windows. Beside him sat families of other compound survivors, children who'd grown into adults while their parents waited, parents who'd grown old while their children forgot their names. They'd found each other through Sarah's testimony. This community, of the lost and found. Rebecca Fletcher sacrificed her freedom so her sister could come home, Pastor Fletcher said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. She knew that one light escaping the darkness was better than both being snuffed out. Today we honor her courage, and we celebrate the miracle of Sarah's return. Sarah touched the worn cover of the blue hymnal on the piano bench, the same one she'd carried through 2 years of wandering, the same one that had identified her when she collapsed in this very aisle. Inside the front cover, both names were still there in careful 12-year-old handwriting. Property of Sarah and Rebecca Fletcher, 1993. As the service ended and people filtered out into the December sunshine, Sarah remained at the piano, playing the melody of their childhood duets. She couldn't sing Rebecca's part. That harmony was lost forever, but she could carry the memory of it in every note. Through the sanctuary windows, she could see families reuniting in the parking lot, survivors finding each other, a community, slowly healing from wounds that had festered for decades. Rebecca would never see this restoration, but her sacrifice had made it possible. Sarah Fletcher had finally come home, carrying her sister's courage with her like a song.